again. Thank you so much for listening to my lecture. And I have received some questions that I will try to answer now. The first question comes from Franklin, North Carolina. And the question is, were immigrants from specific provinces such as Småland or Skåne or bigger regions drawn to emigrate for reasons that differ from other places? And the answer is that on a general level, the reasons for the emigration they were similar in Sweden. As I mentioned, I think it had to do with the population increase, it had to do with scarce economic resources in the country in general. Having said that, certain areas of the country experienced heavier migration that could be attributed to particularly difficult economic conditions in some areas, in rural areas. The urban areas where cities began to grow and where economic opportunities were more plentiful had lower rates of emigration. So there's a clear distinction there between countryside and city. I think it's also important to emphasize the significance of the emigration tradition, and that once the migration had begun from a particular area, it continued, it tended to continue, even though the economic conditions might improve. And this kind of stock effect that some historians have identified is very interesting. And it tied together particular communities, sending communities, with particular receiving communities. And you could see this kind of transplantation of peoples back and forth in both directions, actually, over a long period of time. So these kinds of specific links are created and play an important role. And they also account for some of the differences in the migration history between different countries, but different places in Sweden. A second question, also from North Carolina, is how did relations between Sweden, Norway, and Denmark change from mass migration times to now? Of course, a very big question. In terms of political relations, we should note that Sweden and Norway were in a union during much of the time of the mass migration. From up until 1905, there was a union of the Swedish and Norwegian monarchies, a union which was increasingly more resented in Norway, and towards the end of the 19th century, a fair amount of Norwegian nationalism resulted in the eventual breakup of the union in 1905, which meant that Norway became an independent country for the first time since the Middle Ages. That affected Norway a lot, this break away from Sweden. It created a strong sense of Norwegian nationalism. It also affected the migrants to America. Those Norwegians who left for the United States came to the US with a stronger sense of Norwegianness, I think, than many of the Swedes. The national feelings in Sweden were weaker than the national feelings in Norway. In Sweden, I think we can say that the identities were more regional. People identified more with Småland or Värmland or Skåne, perhaps more than with Sweden as such. So that's an important factor in the kind of Swedish-Norwegian relations there. And the breakup of the union resulted in some hard feelings, not terribly hard, but some hard feelings. And some of these conflicts also played out in America between Swedish Americans and Norwegian Americans. The Danes, of course, had a much lower rate of emigration than both Sweden and Denmark. The Danish-Swedish relationship, that was a relationship of rivalry for many centuries. They were the two big countries in the Nordic area and were often at war with each other. The World War II was, of course, a very, very important factor in Scandinavian history when Denmark and Norway were both occupied by Germany from April of 1940 to May of 1945, to the end of the war, where Sweden remained neutral. Sweden remained outside of the war, and Finland, of course, was attacked by the Soviet Union in 1939, and then was drawn into the so-called war of continuation with the Soviet Union on the German side. So World War II, the effects of World War II were fundamental on Scandinavia and on Scandinavian cooperation in particular. At the beginning of the war, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark had all declared neutrality and tried to stay out of the war, and there had been some attempts to kind of Nordic cooperation, but that broke down as a result of the war. And after World War II, the Scandinavian countries or the Nordic countries came to very different conclusions about their national interest. Norway and Denmark came to the conclusion that they needed to be in some kind of a defense alliance, and they joined NATO. Sweden did not join NATO. The old policy of neutrality precluded Sweden from joining NATO. And Finland, of course, fell into an uneasy relationship with the Soviet Union. The war with the Soviet Union and the war of continuation had defeated Finland and placed the Soviet Union in a very strong position vis-a-vis Finland. And the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, of course, became a part of the Soviet Union after World War II. Finland did not. Finland remained independent, but had a very special relationship with the Soviet Union. And it became very mindful of that, and a treaty of cooperation and friendship existed between Finland and the Soviet Union after World War II, all the way up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So the different Scandinavian countries came to different conclusions when it came to security policy. And that also affected the relationships between the different countries. Before Norway and Denmark joined NATO, there was an attempt to create a joint Scandinavian defense alliance, but that came to nothing. And it was not until the 1990s, the middle of the 1990s, when all of the Scandinavian countries, including Finland, finally joined the EU and then found themselves in an alliance with each other. So it's a rich and interesting period there, the post-war period, and the different types of relations that were created between the different Scandinavian countries. We also have a question that reads, what are some other more contemporary examples of depictions of Swedes and Vikings in American popular culture? When it comes to the Vikings, I think I talked about the movie there. We saw the Norsemen, and there's a whole series of popular culture representation of Vikings up until the present time. TV series, kind of action series, adventures series depicting the heroic Vikings, and this interest in you can think of Game of Thrones, for example, which is inspired by, if not an exact Viking story, but certainly inspired by Viking culture and Viking history. So that continues, that interest continues in the Vikings. When it comes to representation of Swedes in American popular culture, it exists. There is a website somewhere which tracks every mention or use of Swedish character in American TV and film. But we do have kind of the stereotypical, one representation is the stereotypical representation of the immigrant, the kind of the dumb Swede, the Jan Jansson from Wisconsin, those kinds of ethnic stereotypes that have existed in American popular culture. But we also have representations of for example, we talked about the Swedish sin and Swedish blondes and so forth. If you have seen the film The Producers, there you will find one of the secretaries there in the Producers is Ulla, and she's a Swedish blonde, and she speaks with a heavy accent. And also remind you of the Muppet Show with the Swedish chef there, who speaks in this kind of hooty speak. And so forth. So there are some representations of Swedes in popular culture as well. And I think that they pick up on some of these stereotypes that were established fairly early on. Well, that concludes the question and answer session. If you have more questions, please feel free to contact us and we'll be happy to say something more.